Proverbs 13:20 says, "He who walks with the wise will become wise." I'm Dan Chappa, and Turton Fan and I have been friends for many years, and we've learned a lot from each other, including how to debate opposing views while loving the person. We share a foundation in the essentials of the Christian faith and a love of God and His Word. Here we'll dive deep into the Bible and present both Calvinism and Arminianism and the precise points of disconcurrence. Hopefully the contrast will bring you clarity. Welcome to Disconcurring Theo Amigos. Hey, Turton Fan, how you doing?
Doing well. How are you?
Good. It's always good chatting with you. I've been looking forward to the discussion.
Likewise.
Cool. So, we've covered most of the New Testament usage of predestination itself, using that specific terminology. So I figured we'd cover the last passage today. So we've obviously covered the usage in Ephesians, where we saw that people were predestined, and then we covered the usage in Acts, especially Acts 4:28, where an event was predestined, which is specifically the crucifixion. So this last usage, and we've done this backwards because this is probably Paul's first use of the word predestination, is here in 1 Corinthians 2:7. So I'll just go ahead and read the verse. And it's, "But we impart a secret and hidden wisdom of God, which God decreed before the ages for our glory." And what I thought was interesting is it's a little different. It's not about predestining people per se, or events like the crucifixion. This is more, I would say, just a general plan of salvation. When it talks about God, this secret and hidden wisdom, which is essentially that the gospel would be revealed to the Gentiles. Is that your sense for this passage as well?
Hmm. I, in terms of I suppose the question is, what is it that was ordained by God before the ages here, right? I mean, that ultimately that makes a big difference. If we were saying what's pro orizo here is the uh, the crucifixion or Jesus, then we are talking about much the same thing. And that, uh, but the question, I guess, is, I think you're saying that the hidden wisdom that God ordained before the world is what you're identifying as the object.
Yeah. Well, yes. So it is definitely the hidden wisdom. I guess there's a question behind the question, which is, well, what is this hidden wisdom? Um, and so, okay, so just maybe it will help if I just capture some of the inbound context. So just starting at verse 2:1. "And when I came to you, brothers, I did not proclaim to you this testimony of God with lofty speech or wisdom. I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. For I was with you in weakness and fear and much trembling. My speech and my message were not in plausible words of wisdom, but in the demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. And yet among the mature we do impart wisdom, although it is not a wisdom of this age or of the rulers of this age who are doomed to pass away. But we impart a secret and hidden wisdom of God, which God decreed before the ages for our glory. None of the rulers of this age understood it, for if they had known it, they wouldn't have crucified the Lord of glory." So I think it's definitely linked to the gospel message, but I think it's more the fact that the gospel message was to be spread, because it's something that he's now proclaiming, but it before was hidden. And so that's what makes me think that it's talking about the Gentile inclusion in the plan of salvation. And that's the general thrust I've gotten from a lot of commentaries and that sort of thing. And I don't think it necessarily has to be something that we, as Calvinists and Arminians, would sharply divide over.
So I would point out that the I mean, the word wisdom here, if we're using, I don't know which translation you're reading from. I think reading from the King James, I'm not sure. But whether it's the King James or not, the word wisdom supplied by the translators with the uh, with the text saying, but but we speak the wisdom of God in this mystery, the things hidden, uh, or the thing hidden, and the word wisdom doesn't come back after that, right?
Okay. Okay.
Uh,
I'm following you. Go ahead.
and and then the next phrase, the next term there is then this ordained ordained before the world, or before the ages, basically before the world, but before the ages.
Right.
This or ionon, proton or ionon, before the ages, and so I'm not sure. I guess what I guess the question is still, I mean, even if the word wisdom only appears there at the beginning of the sentence, uh, it's still the we
It's
it's it still seems to be referring back to the same wisdom that's mentioned uh, in the previous verse. We speak wisdom among those who are perfect, yet not the wisdom of this world, nor the princes of this world, but the wisdom of God, uh, which God ordained before the world unto our glory. The question, I guess, is what does that wisdom refer to?
right.
And like you said, I mean, in at least on some level, it refers to God's the hidden this hidden. I mean, as the King James translators put it in there, wisdom, the hidden wisdom, the thing that was a mystery, what was hidden. This hidden mystery is God's plan, at least at some level, right? Because uh, it says that the princes of the world didn't know it, and if they had, they wouldn't have done what they did. But and then the next verse, verse 9, the outgoing context, I guess, is using that same nomenclature. Says, "Eye hasn't seen, nor ear heard, nor entered into the heart of man, the things which God has prepared for them that love Him." So it seems to be that also seems to be the stuff that's hidden, that's now revealed. So kind of knowing where exactly to draw the line as far as what's intended by the, the preordination of God, and what exactly is the wisdom? Where do we draw the line around that wisdom? Is the wisdom of uh, the whole plan of salvation, or is it some subset of it? Uh,
Yeah. So the okay. So a couple thoughts. So just circling back. I mean, in the actual phrasing, you're right. There's not a second wisdom. What there is an n, which is a form of os, which is um, basically which. So the which is kind of referring back to the wisdom, and I think that's where they got that idea, where they, I guess, inserted the second wisdom. But just to kind of make it a little more smooth. Now, in terms of defining exactly what this wisdom is, when you think of, well, they wouldn't have crucified the Lord of glory. Well, what, you know, if they knew that Jesus was God, or if they knew of it, that this was part of God's plan of salvation, then they would have been a lot less likely to have crucified the Lord of glory. That seems to have been a part. You could maybe say that just the incarnation in general, but the in the hidden aspect could also be referring to the cross too. Now, the apostles started to find that out, but late in the game, right? The first half of the synoptic gospels, the apostles don't really know about the cross. It's not really until Peter makes his confession, you're the Christ of the Son of the living God, when that actually comes out. And Jesus starts telling them from that time, he starts telling them that his plan is to go suffer and to die and rise again. So it could be hidden in that sense. So I guess it doesn't necessarily have to be the Gentile inclusion just because it's hidden, but it's somewhere in that neighborhood of a general, or basically a plan of salvation through the incarnation and the cross. Seems to fit best with the flow of Paul's overall thought here.
Have you considered, in terms of Paul's overall thought here, the 1 Corinthians 1:24, but unto them which are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. So if it is Christ who's in mind as the wisdom of God and the power of God, then uh, saying that the wisdom was ordained is, could just be another way of saying that Christ was ordained.
Yeah, I think that's right, and um, so just backing up to 1:18. The word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? And then 21, I think, is key. For in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom. It pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. Right? So it's the preaching of the cross, basically this message of salvation through Christ, who was the incarnate Son of God, that is this divine wisdom that no one knew about. And if they had known that, they wouldn't have crucified him. So I think we're not disagreeing with each other. We're just kind of teasing it out a little bit and trying to put a finer point on it. But in general, it's the basic plan of salvation and the cross and Christ and the incarnation, all of that in a package deal. All of that seems to be in view of what Paul is expressing in terms of the wisdom of God here. Uh,
I'm not sure. I mean, I don't have any quick retort to that. I suppose that I would be reluctant to be very dogmatic in saying, well, it has to be only referring to Christ. But I do think that with Christ being the wisdom of God, I do think that it makes sense to think of it, at least in the as the primary referent here, is that Christ was ordained. And because of the fact of what ordained implies, it's not just that he was chosen. He doesn't say chosen; it says ordained. So there's some purpose, there's some plan associated with the person of Christ, and that plan is the crucifixion of Christ. Right. So I certainly wouldn't disagree, but I would just think of it in terms of something similar to some of those previous examples we talked about, where Christ was where the crucifixion of Christ was something that God had planned from the beginning.
yeah, the usage is not that different than Acts. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, 100%. I agree. I
which is
agree.
which isn't surprising.
Yeah. So we're agreeing too much. So let's disagree on something. Okay. So let's maybe back up to 1 Corinthians 1:24, 23 and 24. So I'll read them. So it says, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and folly to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greek, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. So, so for starters, when you look at this calling or kaleo, do you see evidence for what Calvinists sometimes call an effectual call in a passage like this? And if so, why?
Well, let me pull up the Greek to make sure that I'm not misspeaking.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, but unto them who are the called. I suppose that that I would certainly say that there's a broader the term called can have a semantic range, so that there are situations where uh, in the for example, I think it's a textual variant in the Textus Receptus, but there's a couple of places in Matthew where the phrase "for many are called, but few are chosen" is used. I think one of those may be a duplication, if I remember correctly. But in any case, there's at least one of those two, either Matthew 20:16 or Matthew 22:14. And if I'm not mistaken, again, that's the same type of term called. The Greek word is the same.
It is.
So in that case, it says many are called, but few are chosen, and there's a distinction made between those. But then there is within Paul's theology, and Matthew isn't contradicting it. It's just not Matthew is not authored by Paul or by Luke. The in Romans, for example, Paul calls himself a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle. And so when he's using that term called to be an apostle, it's not just kind of invited to be an apostle. So there is a sense in which called can be something like invited. That word itself by itself can have that meaning. But I think Paul has a more technical use of that term. So when he refers to himself as being called to be an apostle, or he says in Romans 1:6, you are also the called of Jesus Christ. And in Romans 1:7, you're called to be saints. All that are in Rome, beloved of God, called to be saints. He doesn't, none of those uses in that first part of Romans, as an example, none of those uses are invited to. He's not a servant of Jesus Christ invited to be an apostle, or the among whom are you also the invited of Jesus Christ. That's not what Paul has in mind by that phrase. And the one, I don't think there's a lot of dispute about those ones in Romans 1. I think Romans 8's use, where he says to those who are called according to his purpose, I suppose there gets to be some dispute about that and whether that's a reference to effectual calling. But I definitely do see that one as being a more clear example of effectual calling. So, kind of moving from Romans to First Corinthians, Paul continues to use a similar expression. At the beginning of First Corinthians 1:1, Paul called to be an apostle of Jesus Christ through the will of God. Again, I don't think that it just has that broader meaning of invited. And then again, onto the church at Corinth, called to be saints. I don't think he has in mind only the invitational side of calling. I think he has something stronger in mind there. Partly because, as in Romans, where it was like Paul, he's called to be an apostle and separated unto the gospel of God. Here in First Corinthians, they're sanctified in Christ Jesus, called to be saints. So now when we come to First Corinthians 1:24, I would tend, I especially considering that the end of the verse says, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God, I would tend to see this as a powerful calling, not just an invitation. And also, it would be very strange to view this as just merely an invitation, because because we know that the gospel invitation as such is well described by Matthew's type of use of called, where many are called, but few are chosen. Whether, even if we set aside, obviously Matthew's not written by Paul, and it needs to be understood in harmony. But I don't think Paul's using that kind of Matthean usage of call. I think he's using one like his previous uses of call, and I actually don't know if he uses anywhere else. But at least in those uses, I think he has in mind a powerful call, not something. And so, yeah, I do. I mean, that's a very long answer. Yes, to your question, do I see it as evidence of effectual call?
Yeah. Okay. So, part of me wants to go and just chase down every single reference you listed and show why they're not the effectual call either. But I'll resist that temptation and focus on this one. So, just for some broader context, there's a usage of it in verse 9 that's helpful, I think. God is faithful, by whom you were called into the fellowship of his Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. So
I'm sorry, you said verse 9?
Verse 9, yeah. So 1 Corinthians 1:9. Yeah. So in verse 9, God is faithful, by whom you were called into the fellowship of his Son, Jesus Christ. And I think there is a group aspect, because we're called into this fellowship and communion with Christ. And I think that's the direction that Paul is going with this, where we're called into this sort of group. I tend to agree with you. So, like, just a sheer invitation alone doesn't seem to account for Paul's language here, because it does seem to be specific to those that are basically saved, right? They're the called in this case. It's the people that are saved. And so there's kind of two groups. There's people that have rejected the gospel, which is the Gentiles, and then there's the people that have accepted the gospel, and they're called the called. And like I said, I agree with you that invitation, even though it might be in the background somewhere, it's not enough of a to account for this usage. So
I'm sorry to interject. I'm just curious about why you're viewing them as the same word. Like, in other words, they're not the same word, but I'm just curious why. Is it just because they're so related? They're kind of etymologically related, or
are you talking about the usage in verse 9?
Yeah, I think unless I'm very mistaken, in verse 9 it's a different word is used.
Let's see what called is. That's a good question.
I think that's kaleo, whereas in verse 24 it's kletos.
You think those two aren't related? Let's see.
I didn't say that that's why I was asking if it's because they're related words, or etymologically related words, but one is kletos and the other is kaleo, right?
Yeah, I guess I wasn't trying to. Okay, so where are you going with this? Like, are you saying, if you're just simply noting that they're slightly different, okay. But if you're trying to make a broader point, maybe we need to talk about that.
I'm not sure that it has I don't think Paul's technical use is the same, between those two words, I guess.
So you don't think verse 9 is helpful in helping us understand verse 24 in terms of the way he's using called, because there's a slight difference in the wording?
I mean, it's a different word. I don't know if you're saying it's a slight difference in word. It's not the same word. It's not just like it's different.
Make your point. Make your point. So you're basically, where are you going with this?
I mean, it just seems like it's kind of a pun almost, but I don't see why that would be significant unless you thought it's that Paul is trying to make a play on words here. But I don't think that you're saying that because it's too far away for that.
Yeah. So I guess I would say that they're going to be roughly the same, and we can use the usage in verse 9 to really help us understand the way Paul is thinking of calling here, in frankly in this whole chapter.
Hmm.
Um, okay, let's carry on. So for the sake of argument, well, we can just focus, isolate to verse 20 24, because I don't think it's going to make that much difference. Um, so here, let me switch back to ESV. All right. So the Jews are demanding a sign, and the Greeks are seeking wisdom. And but the apostles, or specifically Paul, is preaching Christ crucified, and it's a stumbling block to the Jews and folly to the Gentiles. So they're pushing back on the gospel. They're rejecting and continue to reject the gospel. The on the opposite side is the called, who have accepted the gospel. Okay, now I guess let's say that invitation isn't a strong enough sense to satisfy this, and you made some points, and I think the reason why I would agree with that here is that in some sense both are invited because both have the preaching of the gospel. So in that sense, both sides are called, but he's using that specifically in this case for the Jews and Greeks. And you might say, well, like let's say you're at a party and you talk to everyone there and you say, hey, you guys are my invited guests, and it could be that kind of a usage. But even then, I think it's missing something. That type of usage is missing something. And so I wanted to dig a little deeper and see what was going on. And so I think that beyond invited, I think there is some precedent for a better usage that makes a lot of sense out of this passage. Um, and here, I'll start with English because it's easier, and then we'll go into the Greek. But I found two usages. Um, so the first, and we'll go into the LXX, to the Septuagint for Exodus 12:16 and Leviticus 23:2. So in Exodus 12:16, it uses the same word, kaleo, for what's called a holy assembly. And
So not the same word as the verse that we're talking about, but the same word as verse 9.
no, the same word as in verse 23. And
Verse
then
24 is the one that we're is the one that
sorry,
uses
24. Thank you.
verse
Yeah,
24 uses
yeah,
the word kletos,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
not kaleo.
Correct. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And
And
then
in which okay, let me pull I also I sh, let me pull up the Septuagint as well. Uh
right. And while you do
just take
that,
me a little bit longer, sorry.
that's fine. That's fine. Well, while you do that, I'll just lay it out. So, and then in Leviticus 23:2, the same word is used, and it's translated a holy convocation. And it's basically a meeting of all the people of Israel. Um, so what did I say? That was Exodus 12:16.
Exodus 12:16, and the first day shall be called holy.
Yeah.
That's not the use. Let's see. Shall be called holy, and the seventh day shall be a holy convocation to you. You shall. Uh,
Um,
Okay,
w- w-
convocation is the word that's being like in Lancelot Brenton's.
convoc-
Uh,
yeah,
he translates that convocation. I'm not sure
convocate.
he's translating the right. Anyway, but okay.
Yeah,
So
and then the other one is Leviticus 23:2, which again is translated as convocation.
okay.
So, in I'm now here I'm going to be a little hesitant that, but the word just church is ecclesia, called out ones, right? And the usage is seems strikingly similar, to me. A convocation, a church, an assembly gathered by a call. That seems to be the idea. So it has that corporate aspect where it's a group, right? A fellowship. Even though I know you don't like me bringing in verse 9, but it is a fellowship. It's a group gathering summoned by the gospel, which is essentially a church. So I think that's a better sense than invited. Invited is a part of what's intended here, but not everything that's going on. It's also got this group aspect, and then it's specifically put into the context of basically a church or the assembly of those that are gathered together by the gospel call. I think that's what Paul is going for here. Um, does that do any thoughts, pushback, or
Uh, I mean, I don't I don't see the use in Exodus and Leviticus, and in that, I mean, I can, I mean, I definitely confirm that it's the same kletoi that's used in Exodus 12:16 and also in Leviticus 23 2 through 7. I guess there's four instances or so, or even 8. I'm sorry. I guess there's a bunch of instances there uh, where the intent is something about these holy assemblies or these holy convocations or holy gatherings, um, and there. I think it's easier to look at why would you use a term like that for the gathering. It's because everyone's uh, essentially commanded to be there for these things. They're not. It's not a. I mean, you might say that everyone's kind of invited to come to these gatherings, but it's probably a stronger. There's probably something stronger in mind than just a mere invitation. Like, hey, if you're up for it, you can come to one of these feasts. No, these are like, you're supposed to drop everything and come to these feasts. It's not. In terms of why the Septuagint would use that word to translate the term, that it kind of makes sense in that sense. I don't see. I mean, obviously, Paul is not using this term to refer to a, a feast day that's a called out feast day, or anything like that. So it doesn't have the same meaning, uh, and I'm not sure the extent to which. I mean, I certainly think that there's a sense in which we can use this term to refer the uh, to the church, uh, and and the church is as a called out assembly and so forth. But I, there is a sense in which you can refer it to the church because obviously, in some sense, it is the church, right? I mean, we're not saying that the people who are the called, both Jews and Greeks, are some other group than the church in the at least when we think about the church invisible, right? So it's not as though I'm disagreeing on that level with what you're saying. I'm not sure that any of that uh, gets around the idea that this kind of calling in 24, in Paul's use of that term, refers to something other than a powerful calling, uh, as distinct from just a bare invitation or something like that.
Well, let's see. If he had said those who are in the convocation, um, you know, where would you get the idea of an effectual call if you translated it those who are part of the convocation?
Uh, I don't I don't think you're saying that that's the way you should translate it, right? Or are you saying that?
No, no. I mean, I guess I'm not necessarily pushing for the. I'm pushing for that understanding. Yeah, I guess maybe it's more of an interpretation rather than a translation. But I guess what I'm saying is that if you grant at a concept level that this could be a convocation, now you might argue, well, it could be a convocation, but no, it's not, and here are the reasons why X, Y, Z. Okay, I'm open to that. But if it is, if for the sake of argument, it is a convocation, I don't see the concept of an effectual call left. I don't know where it would be coming from. If this concept is a convocation, then whence the effectual call? Now, you could look to other passages and say, okay, well, this passage over here definitely teaches it, but it wouldn't be here. It would be a convocation or a church.
Okay. Well, I guess uh, I if you're saying that you think it should be translated as unto them which are the church, then I don't agree with that understanding. I think that's too, I'm not saying that the people are not the church, but I don't think that's what the passage is calling out about them. It's referring to the fact that they are called. I do think that is the emphasis, and I think it fits well with the rest of the earlier part of the chapter, with Paul being called to be an apostle, and then and the people he's writing to at Corinth are those who are called to be saints. Uh, I I think that he's referring back to those same kinds of concepts when he says to them which are called. I don't think he means to just abstract it into those who show up for church.
So let's take the expression called to be saints, right? They are called. Like, I mean, how is that? That sounds like the gospel call. The call that gathers people together into the body of Christ, into the fellowship of his Son, into the church.
It would sound like that it might sound like a bare invitation, except that the positive there is the church of God, which is at Corinth, them that are sanctified in Christ Jesus, and then placed in apposition to that is called saints. So in that and the just for to smooth it, we say called to be saints. But yeah, in that sense, in that context, it's clearly not just the people to whom the gospel is preached, but actually to those who are sanctified.
Okay, yeah. So if it's called saints, then it's more in the sense of naming, right? They're named saints. But if it's called to be saints, that does sound like the gospel, right? But I think either one of those usages, neither one of those usage again leads to this idea of an effectual call. If there's an argument here for an effectual call, it's in verse 24 where it seems inappropriate to say that the Jews and Greeks are not called. Like it seems like in some sense they are not called, right? Um,
Hold on a second. you said it's appropriate to say that they're not. I'm
Yeah,
missing something.
yeah, right. It doesn't seem right to say that the Jews and Greeks who are rejecting the gospel are the called. They are not the called, right? Somebody else is. So
Okay.
that's exclusive, right? So I could see why someone would make an argument for an effectual call based on 24 if they just simply looked at the calling as it sounds like an invitation, but not an invitation, right? Like it sounds like an effectual invitation because it's exclusive and, you know, bringing people in, that sort of thing. I could see that argument, but and that's why I'm offering an alternative to that approach by saying, well, no, it's probably talking about a convocation. But where I don't see it is in verse, the called to be saints. In that sense, if it's exclusive, then it's just they're named saints, right? They're called saints. Literally, that's the name that's given to them. Um, and that again would be exclusive, but in the sense that it's more of a invitation there, it could be just called to be saints, which is fine. I'm happy with called to be saints too, but then there's nothing exclusive about that. And so if it's not exclusive, then I don't see an argument for effectuality.
Okay. Well, so in terms of the uh, in terms of whether it's an effectual call in two, I suppose if two was standing by itself, you might you might somehow take it as being that they're that it's just another thing that they, it's nothing really special about them, that everyone's called to be a saint, and it's not really especially about them. I don't think that fits very well with the context there, but I think it's harder to argue. It might be harder to argue that point. I think in 24, to reduce this down to saying that called refers to an assembly, I think that on a grammatical level, that doesn't make any sense, even though there's some usage like that in usage of where the word gets translated as assemblies, the holy assemblies, for example, in Exodus in Exodus or Leviticus. Here, it doesn't just say. So in that case, let me pull it back up. In that case, for example, it's the and this is probably stretching the limits of my ability to parse through uh, the Greek, but the this the in verse 124, and I'm not sure if I'm looking at the TR. I'm not sure if the other text is the same or not. I think it is. Uh, Maybe I should pull up the other text just to be on the safe side. So I don't like making arguments that are based only on the TR if there's a difference between the two. Just one second, I'll pull up the other one.
Kletos is the same. Doesn't mean that every aspect is the same. I can just do a staring compare.
1 Corinthians 1:24. Okay, I'm here. So yeah, no, the phrase is the same, but the phrase is this autos de tois kletos. So it's not just kletos by itself. It's autos de tois kletos. And I mean, my Greek pronunciation is terrible. I readily acknowledge. But this autos de tois kletos is they, the autos is the they, or the they, and then the day is of, right? The Maybe that's my. I'm sorry. No, that's not. That's my Latin showing through. It's that's the but, the adversative, right? But uh, so on, it's them, however, or them, uh, but unto them, uh, and then there's this definite article.
Which, yeah.
That's yeah. We translate it as which,
Yeah.
which are called, right? As the phrase, which are called, but it's essentially the called, right? Uh,
Yeah, like
them the called.
yeah, you could say it as like the people who are gathered together.
And if you look at the usage in Exodus 12, Septuagint Exodus 12:16, or Septuagint Leviticus 23, uh, I don't see that same. I don't see a similar construction there, and I don't. I'm looking. I'm just trying to look through to see if I see any
So you could
similar construction to it.
even if the obviously the wording isn't the same, but in Exodus 12, what would be wrong with the idea of well, you could address the people in the holy assembly. What's wrong with that? There's nothing wrong with that.
There's nothing wrong with a lot of things, but what I'm saying is that it's not the same. It's not the same usage, and it's not a parallel usage that you could say that it's a legitimate alternative translation. Here, it's the people who are the called, not it's not using called as a uh, to identify an object like in Exodus and Leviticus, which is why the article usage is different and why this pronomial usage is different here. I don't think that there is a similar usage in the Septuagint. I think maybe in First Kings, 1:41 and 49 or something like that, where you have all the called. But I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't know whether that. I haven't looked to see how that's translated, and I don't. I would be. I'm guessing that it's actually probably there, referring back to people again, not to an assembly. But I haven't looked actually how Lancelot Brenton translates that. I could check.
I'm sorry. First Kings 1:49.
1:41 and 1:49.
There's
Yeah,
nothing obvious in the. Okay, let me try 49.
yeah. All his guests
All
heard.
the guests.
The guests are the people who are called, and then
Oh,
in
what,
49,
what? Hey, there you
all the
go.
guests, all the guests.
How about all the invited ones that actually accepted the invitation? That's that. Anyways, I I digress. How do we sum this up? So
So yeah, I mean that's you can they can be. It's not so much, even if Paul didn't use kletoi seemingly in a more specific way than he uses kaleo. Because he uses kaleo in sometimes in a very almost an aspirational sense, even in Corinthians. Later on in like chapter 7, I think he's like, if you're called to this, then you should be doing this. I don't know if you remember that passage a little bit later in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 7. I think that he does use. I think he's consistent. Of course, he doesn't use it that many times, so it's hard. It's dangerous to draw too strong of a line based on a small number of uses. I'll certainly admit that, but it seems like he's using it in a more, for lack of a better term, like a more of a technical sense of, these are the called people, these are the appointed
so,
people.
so let me go after that in a twist in a different way.
Okay.
Why do we call ecclesio? Why do we translate that as church? I think it's for a very similar reason that it's a technical usage. But why do you think we call ecclesio church? Why don't we call it the called out ones, which is more literal?
Uh, it's interesting you mentioned that, because James White actually brought this up on the dividing line the other day. I
Ah,
don't know if you heard it or not.
no, I missed it. Be
Uh,
very curious into his insight.
I would be curious as well, because obviously he's a Greek professor,
Sure.
and I'm not. Uh, but I would be very interesting. It would be very interesting for me to hear what he had to say about that. I remember him saying that it's a dangerous error to get too hung up on the fact that on the etymology of the term as distinct from
usage.
the term used as such. An interesting thing is, as you say, like if you take the term congregation, I just heard laughter in the background. It sounded like uh, if you take the term congregation and assembly and convocation and uh, there's several terms you can use, and in English at least, they're almost synonymous, like congregation. But congregation is, the etymology is going to be one thing, whereas the etymology of convocation is a little bit different because I know for sure in the case of convocation that it's with calling, like
Yeah,
there's that kind of sense. Whereas congregation, it's more about uh, I
grass
think more about
coming in grass. Yeah,
the movement.
yeah.
But uh, I'm trying to remember if there was more history behind ecclesia, and I cannot recall. I can't recall whether he specifically said it or not, but it is it is a Greek. It's a Latin term. It's also borrowed directly from the Greek. It's a Greek term, and obviously it has the etymology that's on its face from calling. And it would be an interesting question, how did that term get to be used of um, the people who are there, and how did it get to be used the way it's used in the New Testament?
I
How long
would
was that in use before?
I I would be very surprised if it doesn't have underneath the surface the idea of those called by the gospel out of the world and into fellowship with Christ. Um, Now, to throw in another wrinkle, I think there's other uses not besides ecclesia. There's I think ecclesia, called towards. So there's called out of, but there's also called towards, and it's used in a very similar way of the calling of the gospel towards God and towards Christ. Um, uh, in general terms, I think it takes on a technical sense because of familiar use, and it's just you're abbreviating. You're not saying the whole thing every single time, and that's just the way language works. You explain things once, and then you can package deal it up, and then just say, like I said before, right? And then ultimately you get to this word church, which is people called by the gospel to out of the world into the fellowship with Jesus Christ.
I would say that the term definitely predates the New Testament, and its technical usage predates the New Testament. So, so like in Septuagint, Deuteronomy 23, the assembly of the Lord is the ecclesias, the ecclesion kurion, right? So it's a similar usage that would be found in the New Testament, but it's the idea of a congregation or assembly, and using it in that technical sense uh, predates the gospel, and I don't think it would be right to assume that it has only uh, a gospel sense. And
Well, why not?
interestingly, there some of the people who are that that particular passage I mentioned is one about exclusion. So it's like people who have basically eunuchs, children of prostitutes, Moabites. These are people who can't enter the assembly of God.
Yeah.
But to think that means that you can't, if you're a eunuch, you can't be in the kingdom of heaven is clearly wrong in the New Testament, right? So the idea that it's exactly a gospel phrase would be wrong.
Okay. Okay. So I agree I agree to a point. So let's take for example a synagogue and a church. There's It's wrong to say a church is a synagogue or a synagogue is a church or something like that. They're not the same thing, right? We know that, but it's also wrong to say that there's no um, relationship, and they're not from the same root thing. A church is an assembly, a synagogue is an assembly, and that's where those words come from. Um, and so it's wrong to say that they don't have some root commonality into where they came from and how they came to be. But from, if you just take as it's developed, church and assembly aren't the same. The churches have a cross on the top, and the synagogues don't. Anyways, well,
Yeah, I mean, so in terms of I do think it's a little bit risky to get too much into the I don't know. It might be risky to get too much into the etymology, but in that particular term, evidently, the underlying Hebrew term, kahal, is the, can in certain, I guess it's in the Hifil, can refer to summoning an assembly, or in the Nifal, it can refer to to assembly itself, to assembling versus, or to summon to an assembly, are kind of different ways of using that term. In which case, that's, although there's a, in the latter, in the Hifil sense, there's kind of this calling aspect, the summoning aspect. Uh, that that's the emphasis is really more on the getting together as opposed to uh, the calling aspect. It, and yet it's the Greek term that ends up getting used to translate that particular Hebrew term by these Septuagint translators. But I mean, I'm not saying that there. I think, in other words, I think it's easy to kind of load a lot into that Greek term. But since the Greek term was in use already to translate words like kahal in Hebrew, we know we have pretty good reason to think that the New Testament authors, uh, had some understanding of Septuagint usage, particularly the Torah, uh, in at least in their in most of with most of the authors, they seem to have some familiarity with the Septuagint readings that we have in places where they differ from the Hebrew readings. So quite, the idea that they wouldn't be familiar with the pre-existing usage of ecclesia is kind of, I don't know, it seems like it's not, I don't think that it would be fair to say that the term ecclesia is like a term that was invented for the New Testament independently, and it just happens to line up with this term from the Old Testament.
no, agreed. I think we're tracking, but in the New Testament context, it's going to sharpen and start to deviate from just a general synagogue usage, and so we end up with church rather than synagogue, because some of those details start to take shape, right? It's um, yeah. So I think it's just understood. Maybe it's even just better understood in the New Testament when Christ reveals what he does, and his plan of salvation and the cross that was a mystery and all those other things. Um,
But I mean, synagogue is, I'm trying to remember if the term synagogue is even used in the Old Testament. I mean, it's certainly not used in the Old Testament King James Version, but I don't even remember if the underlying Greek term, I mean, so in other words, the Greek term synagogue is a transliteration, if I'm not mistaken, from the is it a transliteration from something Hebrew, or no? Actually, it's not. Is it? It's just it's another term that's that's Greek, because suna is definitely the with, right? So it's a Greek term.
well, So the ecclesias in the Old Testament would be the Jewish assemblies that happened on the Sabbath, right? They weren't on Sundays; they were on Saturdays, and it was the Jewish people gathered together for their time of worship. The ecclesias in the New Testament were on Sundays, and and they were focused around, you know, they would celebrate the Lord's Supper and that sort of thing. So those types of details, like celebrating the Lord's Supper, preaching the gospel, Christ, and stuff like that, that they were basically they were Christians. That shaped what ecclesia means in a sense. It is a development in the usage, right? The usage in the Old Testament time wasn't exactly the same as the usage in the New Testament time. I don't think you would argue that, right? Like you'd agree, right? Like that usage started with the Old Testament usage, but the New Testament usage is clearer and a bit more fleshed out than the Old Testament usage, and it means more.
I think that there's a theology of the ecclesia that's distinct from the theology associated with pre-incarnation gatherings of believers,
Right.
including this Deuteronomy 23 assembly of the Lord.
Right.
But I don't think that it's so. I don't think that I think that at least at some level there is a continuity between. There's at some level a continuity and at some level a discontinuity between this assembly of the Lord, and I think it's an intentional choice of Christ to use ecclesia, an existing term for an assembly of the Lord, to refer to the assembly of his people.
So there's both continuity and development in the usage of ecclesia.
But I think most of that has very little to do with the etymology of the word. To kind of make a long, or I don't know, to loop us back to the main discussion. And I really think ultimately, I would be interested if you found someone, and I know you sometimes do this, where you I don't remember which one it is, but Bible Gateway, maybe you can, with one click, you can see all the people who have translated the text. I would be very surprised, given the way that the Greek articles and pronouns are, if anyone would translate this as church or assembly, even though I wouldn't be surprised if Lancelot Brenton was joined by numerous translators of the Septuagint in translating similarly those uses in the Old Testament, which have they're associated with different article usage and different pronouns.
Well, I don't think I've ever seen a translation that uses assembly. That's interesting. I could look real quick. But I have something that maybe is better. So I have a usage by Clement. This is Clement of Alexandria. And commenting on this passage, he says that all having been therefore called, those who are willing to obey have been named called.
Where is this? Which of his works is this in? Do you know?
Okay, so it's in Stromata, Book 1, Chapter 18. And while you're pulling that up, I can give you some context. So,
I'm there.
Okay, so, and it's in the middle of that big block paragraph. But I'll back up and start with, but to them who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is the power of God, the wisdom of God. Should we understand, as it is better that the words rendered, hath not God made foolish the wisdom of the world negatively? God hath not made foolish the wisdom of the world, so that the cause of their hardness of hearts may not appear to proceed from God, making foolish the wisdom of the world. For on all accounts, being wise, they incurred greater blame in not believing the proclamation. For the preference and choice of truth is voluntary. But the declaration, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, declares him to have sent forth light by bringing forth in opposition the despised and contempted barbarian philosophy, as the lamp, when shone upon by the sun, is said to be extinguished, on account of its not having exerting the same power. All having been therefore called, those who are willing to obey have been named called. So that's an interesting analogy. Like there's a lamp, right? It is a light, but compared to the sun, it's as if they don't have the light at all. So the Gentiles have the gospel; they have been called, but compared to those that have accepted, they're not called, right? Because relative to the sun, the lamp is nothing, even though it is something.
I mean, I would say the way that he's wrestling with the text here, I think, is illustrative of a similar wrestling that you and I are going through in terms of how do we interpret this text. I mean, he seems like it seems to me, reading what he has to say, that he does see that there's a sense in which this text appears to be that the hardness of their heart does appear to proceed from God. And therefore, he wants to flip the term. He says that literally. He says, should we not understand, as is better, the words rendered, has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? Negatively, God has not made foolish the wisdom of the world. So, I mean, he's literally wants to flip it on the head to avoid pinning this on God. And I mean, that's one way to look at it, is to say, well, he's Clement sort of rejecting early Calvinism or something like that, right? But another way to look at it is like, wow, that's it's almost like there is a real sense in which people struggle with this issue, which is kind of a bigger issue than we're talking about here in terms of what does the text say, but the bigger issue of to what extent are we going to place this on God? And Clement here, Clement of Alexandria, seems to be obviously on the side of trying to preserve that from being blamed on God in any way, right? So he's that's why he makes a comment like there's no unrighteousness with God. Well, the reason he's making that is because he's implying that if God were to if this were to be on God, that would somehow there'd be unrighteousness in God by doing that, right? It's kind of one of the critiques of Calvinism. Clement seems to be buying into that critique. Obviously, I'm not saying there was Calvinism per se in that time. It's obviously anachronistic, but he seems to be arguing with the idea, with an interpretation of this that doesn't flip the meaning from has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world to God has not made foolish the wisdom of the world.
Yeah, right. So that's an interesting observation. I mean, it sounds like you're, in a nutshell, you're saying he's wrong.
Well, I mean, obviously, I think he's wrong, but I'm
Yeah.
also saying that I think he sees the problem that if you just take the text at face value, it sounds what I would call Calvinistic. Not that he had any concept of the 5 points of Calvinism,
Yeah.
but
That may be. I think it's the same with, he sees an exclusiveness of the calling language, right? Like that it's exclusive, and he wants to try to explain, well, it's exclusive in one way, but it's not exclusive in another way, I think I definitely see that in what he's saying here. Well, interesting. I guess in some ways we're reading him, we're reading Clement the same, which is good. And earlier in the discussion, a Calvinist and an Arminian agreed on predestination. It's like, that's a first. That's pretty cool. Even if it was a passage that's usually not in too big of a dispute. But that's great. So if we probably should wrap this. Just to see if I can sum this up. I mean, I think you and I agree that invitation, or at least invitation alone, doesn't account for Paul's usage of kaleo and kletos in 1 Corinthians 1:24. So invitation is part of it, but it's not the whole story. It can't be the whole story because it is exclusive. Also, because it has a group aspect, and I would argue for more of an assembly or a convocation type sense, whereas you would argue for, to use your terminology, a powerful call or an effectual call. Basically, it's like an invitation, but an invitation that you can't say no to. Is that
Summoning, a summoning, a summons.
a summons? But a summons you can't say no to, right?
I mean, earthly summons people sometimes try, right? And then you get a show cause telling you to get there in court, and the sheriffs come after you and drag you into court, and
Yeah,
then you get not just
he,
called but drawn as well.
yeah,
Drawn to the court. Yeah, but
like Jonah.
like Paul
Yeah,
in when he got drawn out of the city by the
yeah,
people, drawn before the judges. But the yes, so I'm a little bit derailing your comments by throwing in my 2 cents, but I think there's a sense in which Paul, when he says that he's called to be an apostle, or that the Corinthians were called to be saints, but that they were sanctified and called to be saints, I do think that he has in mind in those uses, and in the use in Romans 8, and in the uses in Romans 1, that in each of those uses, I think he does have in mind something more. And I understand the kind of unfairness of me kind of saying it does mean that in all these other passages which we haven't discussed, and but I do, although we kind of discussed Romans 8 at one point, but I do think that it has I think he's using it in a sense that's more like appointed, or even more than just summoned, more like appointed. So when he's called to be an apostle, I think he really means something more like appointed as an apostle. And when he called saints, appointed as saints. And when here, I think he's saying those that God appoints, to them, the gospel is not foolishness. And I think it is important to have it mean something. And I think you're on board with this point. This would be a concurrence as opposed to disconcurrence, which is if all it meant was the gospel call, that wouldn't make much sense, because in the previous context, there are people who are hearing this and it's foolishness to them. So it can't be that it's foolishness to some people and but to those who hear the gospel, it's not. And hearing in just a sense of the words striking their ears, it can't mean just that. It has to mean something more. And
yeah,
while I just don't think that uh, I don't know. I do think it's interesting to hear. I do think it's interesting to hear where Clement tries to take it. I don't know if there's a better. I mean, I don't know if there's a stronger case than the kind of nominalism that he has. Like, he kind of expresses a nominal thing. He says even though those all having been called, those who are willing to obey have been named called, and kind of like they're called the called, but they're just called that because they're the ones who listened. Like, that's very close to the idea that it's kind of that it's the church, which is called the church, even if it's not, and that kind of separates it from that etymological meaning of called out. But I mean, obviously, we do just concur on that point. So I'm going to continue with your summation. I don't want to derail it too much.
no, I think we're tracking. I think we've, um, at least I think we've understood each other, and that alone is sometimes a mighty feat. So I think that's good. I think we, In terms of next steps, I mean, we could look at other passages on call and calling. I'd like to get there. I'd like to circle back to it, but I think there might be one other passage that, while we're still looking at these predestination texts, maybe we should look at, which is the Acts 13:48 text, which is a really important passage. And I'll be honest, frankly, I'd say it's a challenging one. It is a challenging one uh, for non-Calvinists in general. It's a it took me a while. I kind of wrestled with this view versus that view, and I had to really research hard to figure out and have a good solid position on it. So it's up to you, but I'd recommend we look at the Acts 13:48 passage, if that sounds good.
That sounds good. There is another passage that I do want to bring up,
Okay.
and I want to discuss at some point.
All right.
Not today, because we're kind of we're wrapping things up here, but I want to mention it for future episodes, and that is, let's see if I can find the passage. I found it. I believe it's Romans 11, 36. Yes, Romans 11:36. That's the one I would like to discuss at some point with you, especially in view of Molinism versus Calvinism.
For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory forever. Amen. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Not the amen part. I think we'll have concurrence on what that means.
Yeah, that's the only word. Yeah, yeah, and I'm sure that in your view, I will have more errors than are words in this sentence. So
It's possible to have that. That's possible to occur, but I think that it's a significant text.
Yeah,
and I think it also connects. I would be connecting it with Acts 17. And I can tell you which verse that is. Acts 17, 28.
so okay.
So that combination of verses is something I would like to discuss at some point. It doesn't have to be next time or even the time after that, but just at some point.
Okay, that all sounds good. I'm happy to do it. It was great having a time to chat with you. God be with you.
And with you.